Hey there. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to complete the notes on succession and carbon cycle. So this is going to be two packet pages, that we're going to use. So we'll start with packet page 154 on succession and the carbon cycle. And then we will flip the page in our notebook and take a look at packet page 155 on the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So let's get started with packet page 154. So do you think ecosystems always stay the same? You know, the forests and the grasslands we see, were they always exactly as they look today? No. And I think we all know that they definitely change over time. New species move into ecosystems, or maybe species die off or they migrate away over hundreds or thousands of years. So there are natural changes in plants and animals that take place in an ecosystem over time. And we call that succession. So there is a order to how plants and animals develop in a given ecosystem. So, for example, the very first species to live in a new environment is called a pioneer species. So hopefully that, we've heard of pioneers, the first people to move out west, when we were growing the United States, back in the 1800s, we called them pioneers. And that's because they were the first people to travel to a new area. So we took that word from pioneer species because they're the first species to grow or live in a new ecosystem. So pioneer species can be fungi or mosses or even lichens. So very small plants that take over, and of course fungi. That can develop because you've got barren rocks on these ecosystems. Then at the very end, we have a climax community. So this is when you have a stable community that's not changing very much. So think of a big, coniferous forest, large oak trees, hardwoods everywhere. That's a climax community. So very, very old, tall trees. So there are two types of succession. The first is primary succession. This is when living things begin to grow on empty land that began with no living organisms at all. So for example, the Hawaiian Islands. So we had underwater volcanoes that erupted, and as they cooled, they created islands. So the lava hardened into rocks, and you had your pioneer species that came in, lichen, over on driftwood or carried on the wind or something. And so they would cling to the rocks. They would start to break the rocks apart to get to the minerals inside. And then as they died, the lichens, they eventually formed the very first layers of soil on these islands. And then from that soil, larger plants were able to develop and take root, and then eventually animals could live there. Most of the time brought over by humans, or birds would maybe fly to the island because they saw that there were resources there now, like food. So primary succession is when you begin from barren rock with pioneer species. And an example of that is the Hawaiian Islands. The second type of succession is called secondary succession. This is when the ecosystem rebuilds itself after it has been disrupted. So we're starting from scratch, but not complete barren rock, nothing there scratch. So there's still soil. But for example, secondary succession may happen after a forest fire, either intentionally or unintentionally. So fire comes through, maybe burns down the forest. There's still soil, there's still other plant matter, but we do have to build again. Secondary succession can also happen with abandoned farmland. So you've got land that's been cleared for farming, but maybe the family moved or they're no longer farming. And so the forests nearby or the grasses, they just start to grow wild. And eventually you end up with a forest on that farmland. So both of those are examples of secondary succession. So just a reminder, succession means changes in plants and animals in an ecosystem that take place over time. So the type of plants and animals that are moving in and the order in which they move into the ecosystem. There are two types of succession, primary and secondary. So the type of succession where an ecosystem forms from totally empty land, remember that is primary succession, like any type of island. We said Hawaiian Islands, but really any island. And then the type of succession where an ecosystem rebuilds after a disaster is secondary succession. Perfect. So down at the bottom of these notes, we're going to take a look at the carbon cycle. So all living things must contain carbon. Right? We've talked before about our macromolecules, cho, chon, chomp. So we know all living things contain carbon. And anything that contains carbon is called organic. So carbon-based life forms, we are organic. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon through the biosphere. Remember, the biosphere is the part of the earth that contains all living things. So up into the atmosphere, right, we have carbon dioxide, right, as a gas. At the ground level and even underground, we have carbon locked away in plants and animals. We have carbon that is stored in soil and in rocks, and carbon that's also in the oceans. So the carbon cycle is just the movement of carbon through the biosphere, and the biosphere is where all life exists. So how is it that we get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to land? That is going to be through photosynthesis. So plants will take carbon dioxide in, remember, through the stoma, which are the openings on their leaves, which are surrounded by the guard cells. So plants use photosynthesis to bring carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the land. And then from the biosphere to the atmosphere, we have cellular respiration. So carbon dioxide is brought from the atmosphere to the land in photosynthesis, but it is returned to the atmosphere through cellular respiration. So next notebook page, let's take a look at the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. So starting with the nitrogen cycle, all living things need nitrogen in order to make nucleic acids and proteins inside our cells. So remember, we've got our nucleic acid here, which could be DNA or RNA. But nitrogen in the air is in the form of N2 or nitrogen gas, and plants cannot use this form of nitrogen. So they're going to use bacteria and fungi to help plants get the nitrogen. So the plants, right, the bacteria and fungi grow on the roots of plants to turn nitrogen gas into a form that plants can actually use. And this is called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixing bacteria in the root nodules of legumes, which is a bean plant. So these bacteria and fungi they grow on the roots of the plants and they fix the nitrogen into a different form. So it comes in as a gas and they change it into a different form so that the plants can actually use it. So nitrogen fixation is when bacteria and fungi turn nitrogen in the air into a form of nitrogen that the plants can actually use. The relationship between bacteria or fungi that live on the roots of plants is a mutualistic relationship. So remember, that was a good relationship. Both the bacteria and or fungi, along with the plant, they are both benefiting from this relationship. So the plant and the bacteria. Over on the right-hand side of our notes, we've got the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is needed by living things to make nucleic acids and phospholipids. So again, remember, nucleic acids are one of our 4 macromolecules, DNA and RNA. And phospholipids, right, are lipids, another macromolecule, but specifically phospholipids make up our cell membranes. So very important part to our cells. Phosphorus gets into the water when rocks erode and when animal waste washes away when it rains. So erosion is a very slow process where rocks are broken down into sediment. And as rocks erode, they release the phosphorus that's trapped inside back into the biosphere. But animal waste, so when an animal poops, right, the phosphorus that's inside of it, either from what it ate, can wash away, in a big rainstorm, especially if you don't pick up your animal's poop or it's wild animal and they poop wherever they want, that can get washed into a body of water and then enter the water cycle that way. Nitrogen and phosphorus can cause a lot of problems, especially in large quantities. So there are 2 ways that nitrogen and phosphorus can get into lakes and streams, and that is through runoff and feces. So runoff, meaning we've got a big storm, pushes the sediment that's eroded from the rocks into a stream, or feces, the poop. When the nitrogen and phosphorus get into lakes and streams, they can cause an algae bloom or an algal bloom. And this can end up killing a lot of the fish and the plants that are in the lake because the algae basically creates a thin layer on top of the water, and that blocks the sun from getting into the water to maybe the seaweed or the phytoplankton that do photosynthesis and put dissolved oxygen into the water. And if there isn't enough dissolved oxygen in the water, then the fish will essentially suffocate to death. So large algae blooms are caused by high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus that are either being dumped or accidentally making their way into rivers and streams. There are a couple ways to prevent these algae blooms. Number 1, we could try to use less fertilizers. So instead of using a fertilizer, maybe you try to do a compost. If we do have to use a fertilizer, maybe we could try to use a fertilizer that has less nitrogen and phosphorus as its ingredients. And we can also try to prevent animal waste from washing away when it rains. This is more along the lines of large commercial farms. Think of the hog waste farms. The hog farms in eastern North Carolina. There was a big hurricane that came through quite a few years ago now, but it caused the waste ponds on these hog farms to essentially overflow, and all of that hog poop ended up washing out into the local streams and lakes, and that caused a very large algae bloom. That water was no longer safe to drink. It was very toxic. So we can try to use less fertilizer, use fertilizers that have less nitrogen and phosphorus, and also try to prevent animal waste from washing away in the rain. So make sure to pick up after your animal. That is it for these notes on succession, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Thanks.